Hello, and welcome back to Extraordinary Connection. My name is Robert Blanchard, and I'm the pastor at Lansing First United Methodist Church. Now, you're seeing me 2 weeks in a row so that hopefully, starting next week, Pastor Matt and I can get back into the rhythm of alternating our devotions for you each week. Last week, I presented the idea of approaching our faith with a poetic logic rather than a linear logic. During that devotional, I used the example of worship to briefly illustrate that technical prowess is not actually the thing that makes a worship meaningful or authentic. This week, I want to revisit that idea of poetic logic to talk about discipleship. We all know that if our church is growing and bringing in more members, then that means that our church is healthy, right? After all, when Jesus gave us the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel, according to Matthew, he told us to go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that he has commanded us. So, if we're bringing in more members, if we're baptizing more babies, then clearly we are fulfilling the Great Commission, right? I mean, it is getting to be that time of year when we start preparing to submit our statistics to the conference, and we all want to show how much we've made the numbers go up, because if numbers are going up, then we are healthy and doing well. If we were a business and all we cared about was the bottom line, then that would be true. But we're not a business, we're the church. The logic of business and the logic of church are not the same things and are not interested in the same metrics. And if you've ever been involved with discussions involving the membership roles at your congregation, then you likely already have some insight that these things aren't that simple. Around the time that I was baptized as a teenager, the pastor at my church shared a joke with those of us in the confirmation class. It's about a church that's having lots of problems with bats in the belfry. And this poor church has tried everything that they can think of to get rid of these bats. The trustees have gone up there and they've tried to seal it up. They've called pest removal specialists and nothing will work. So then the pastor has a great idea. The pastor grabs a basin with some water in it and heads on up there and confirms the bats as members of the congregation. And after that, they never saw the bats again. Here's the point that I'm trying to make. Every church that I have ever been a part of has baptized children who have no connection to the congregation and whom they have no intention of nurturing in the faith. This isn't an indictment of infant baptism, but of a church culture that is driven by a numbers mindset. Now, maybe the parents who want their children baptized aren't thinking that way. They may have concerns about what happens to their child if they die without being baptized. They may want their child baptized because that seems like the thing that you're supposed to do, or it's the thing that grandma and grandpa keep telling them that they have to do. But from the church side, we are doing a disservice to them and to the gospel if we make a commitment that we have no intention of keeping. Again, if you've ever been involved in tracking membership, you'll know that this creates a problem because in the eyes of the United Methodist Church, once you become baptized, you are a member of the church. You may not be a full member with rights to vote in a charge conference or anything like that, but you are technically a baptized member of the church. Entry into the church is not something for us to be taking lightly. And you may be asking yourself, well, Pastor Robert, if this is something that happens in every church that you've been in, then why ask those questions about large churches earlier? And here I want to draw our attention to a couple of studies that I saw this week. The first was one that Pastor Dylan actually found and shared with us. It's called 20 Years of Congregational Change, the 2020 Faith Communities Today Overview, which was conducted by Faith Communities Today. They've been tracking information about 15,278 religious communities in the United States since the year 2000. As I looked at the data in this study, there was one piece that really jumped out at me. I mean, there's a lot in there that I'm going to keep unpacking, but there's this one piece that I think illustrates the different kind of logic that we need if we are to view the church as something more than a business that is interested in bringing in as many clients as we can. What they found was that the smallest churches in our country tend to be declining at faster rates than other churches, and that the biggest churches tend to be growing at a larger rate than other churches. In other words, the small churches are getting smaller and the big churches are getting bigger. And if we're treating our churches like businesses, then this makes perfect sense, because it's the same exact trend that we are seeing economically. But here's the catch, and here's the part that fascinated me. The study states the smallest 70% of congregations, those with worship attendance of 100 or less, were characterized as having a high level of member commitment. These faith communities had a greater percentage of member participation in weekly worship. The participants gave more money per person and were more likely to volunteer. These congregations spent less on staffing costs and gave the highest percentage of their budgets in support of missions and charity. By comparison, they observe, however, it is also true that the larger the congregation gets and the faster it grows, the greater the decline in per capita giving. Growth and large size also correlate to smaller percentages of the congregation willing to volunteer and a lower overall level of participant commitment generally. While larger congregations had lower per capita costs to operate, larger percentages of their budgets went to staff costs and program expenses. What this study shows is that the more rapidly a church grows and the larger that a church gets, the less willing individuals become to give of their time, money, and talents, and the less of their budget that they're actually donating and dedicating to mission work. Now, that isn't to say that if you belong to a large church that you are personally less committed than someone in a small church. What it is saying, though, is that on the whole, the bigger a church gets, the less active participation that they are nurturing in their congregation. In other words, if a church grows rapidly and gets to a certain size, they are statistically less likely to be creating healthy disciples. So are those churches honoring the Great Commission? Well, they're certainly baptizing people, but are they actually making disciples? Are they teaching people to obey everything that Christ has commanded them? And it's on this question that I want to offer this last thought, and it comes from the State of Religion and Young People 2021 report by the Springtide Research Institute. This study surveyed more than 10,000 young people across the country from ages of 13 to 25 about their spiritual practices and across different faith lines as well. What they found is that 51% of those young people who identify as very religious say that they have engaged in acts of protest at least monthly, compared with only 24% of young people who are non-religious. Further, 20% of those very religious young folks say that they engage of acts of protest on a daily basis. If we narrow in and look just at Christian respondents, we see that Catholic or Protestant, it doesn't make a difference, because 44% of each of those groups engage in protest on a monthly basis. So if you wonder where the young people are, the answer is that they are taking their faith seriously enough that they are out in the streets doing something about it. Now, let me conclude by saying this. Obviously, membership and giving numbers can help us to get some sense about the vitality of a congregation. But what the data suggests is that those numbers are better at helping us know when something is going wrong than they are when something is going right. Rising membership numbers and rising giving numbers are not nearly as clear of an indicator of a healthy church as suddenly decreasing numbers are indicators of an unhealthy church. So while those kinds of numbers can serve as symptoms in diagnosing the vitality of a congregation, we really have to ask a different kind of question. We have to operate on a different kind of logic in order to identify healthiness. Are we making disciples? Are we changing lives? Are people, by their encounter with Christ through us, transforming the way that they live? Are they taking their faith seriously enough that they are giving their time, money, and talents in service of building God's kingdom, both within the church and out in the streets? So, friends, until I see you again, I hope you keep mulling over this information and these questions. And I will see you next time on Extraordinary Connection.